I'm Kenneth Welsh. You're watching Northern Mysteries. Of all the supernatural phenomena, possession has to be one of the most controversial. Does the devil really exist? Can he possess a human being? Can a person become a victim of repeated attacks by the forces of evil? Beyond the debate between science and religion lie the victims. This is the tragic story of Maurice Thériault, one such victim.
This story was supposed to end this evening in the spring of 1985. That was the hope of those who gathered and prayed for Frenchie, the man seated among them. The man appeared to be in intense pain, as though battling an inner demon in a nightmare. Vile spirit, whoever you are, I command you to abandon this servant of God. I command you in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior. The prayer was not addressed to the man, but to the being in possession of his soul. I exorcise you, vilest of spirits, you enemy of the good and all its servants. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, I command you to release this child of God. Aside from the police officer filming the strange ritual, the group, driven by fear, now prayed more fervently. In the name of our Lord, I command you to tell me who you are. The possessed man uttered a long guttural moan.
I am who I am. I am the one and only.
It was the voice of humanity's old enemy, the voice of evil incarnate. Maurice Thériault was born in 1935, the firstborn child of Maxime and Imelda Thériault, farmers living in Saint-Agathe in Quebec. By the time Maurice turned 10, his family had moved south of the border to Fort Kent, Maine. The years after the war were hard times, and the boy often had to work long hours in the fields.
He would be working in Maine with his father. That's what he was forced to do. He was forced to work on the farm.
He was pulled out of third grade in school, made to do like everything farm-wise, all the house chores, take care of all the other siblings in the house.
Maurice was a normal kid to a certain extent until, let's figure it, he was in third grade. So I would say that would probably have been about 8 or 9 years of age. And he witnessed something in the barn. The father was involved in a case of bestiality. His father hated him for the fact that he actually got to see that. And then he forced him to do the same thing.
It was no secret in Fort Kent that Maxime Thériault was abusive, especially towards his young son Maurice. But as often happens in such cases, the community preferred to look the other way. With no help, left to his own devices, the boy could only dream of the day when he could escape the clutches of his cruel father. One afternoon, coming back from the fields, where like countless times before he had again been beaten by his father, young Maurice shouted, "I'd rather work for the devil than keep on working for you." And for the devil he will work. The day Maurice turned 21, he left home without telling a soul and bought a bus ticket for New Britain, Connecticut. There he met Patricia Ann O'Brien and soon fell in love, but their marriage didn't last.
Thank you.
We can't document anything regarding the bizarre behavior until he married at a young age his first wife.
Sometimes Maurice would go into a trance. He seemed to turn into another person.
Yes.
And on at least 2 occasions, unexplainable supernatural events accompanied his attacks. One time, the crucifix above his head appeared to bleed. And on at least one other occasion, witnesses swore they had seen Maurice Theriault at the same time in 2 different places.
He began to have strange things happen. He could bilocate, which means that he could be in 2 places at one time. We know that through bilocation, it can come about from the divine, as in the case of men like Padre Pio, a man who lived during our lifetime, or it could come about through the demonic. In Maurice's case, it did.
These events terrified Patricia, who preferred a divorce to these terrors. Maurice was once again left all alone. Not long after, he met a woman named Tina. This new relationship in the life of Maurice Theriault, nicknamed Frenchie because of his accent, would not last either.
Maurice was a good man when Maurice was Maurice. But when Maurice came under possession by the demonic, he had very strange powers.
Practically illiterate, Maurice drifted from one odd job to another. But his life was being ruined not so much by poverty, but by the strange events in his life that were becoming more common. He would often be absent-minded, as if he was overtaken by something. Maurice would then lose all contact with reality and become a completely different person.
It started with little things. I would notice just different things around the house, like the way he would act. My father had a 3rd grade education. He started talking in this weird language, and then and it wasn't French.
Maurice could speak in Latin, no formal education at all, and the Latin that he spoke was correct. So that was pretty amazing. I don't know of too many people that can just call on another language and speak, especially a dead language, and then refer to religious connotations and basically be right on the money.
While going for a drive with Tina, Maurice was suddenly seized by a frightening trance. In the grip of a severe attack, he let go of the controls. Tina distinctly saw the wheel and gas pedal respond as though an invisible force were driving the car. Her desperate attempts to snap her husband out of that state were in vain. Tina was convinced that an invisible force wanted to kill them. Fearing for her own safety and the lives of their young children, she put an end to their relationship. After a long period of living alone, in the late 1970s, Maurice met Nancy. He felt that this time with her, things would be really different. But Maurice continued falling victim to his mysterious attacks. In June 1982, his father, Maxime, the man he hated so intensely, killed his wife in cold blood, and then shot himself.
I know that my grandfather took my grandmother to Oklahoma for a vacation, and my mom had to call me. I was at school, and he had shot her. Actually tried to shoot her twice. The first bullet missed. He shot her in the head, and then he killed himself. He shot himself.
His mother's murder and father's suicide only made things worse for Frenchie. His strange attacks became more common. As the months went by, Nancy became increasingly worried about Maurice's safety, as well as her own.
My father, he got scared himself and didn't know what was going on. He first went to the police. They told him, "You're nuts." After things started to get worse, then he called the priest.
We were contacted by a priest by the name of Father Homer Boyer in Warren, Massachusetts. He told us about this French-Canadian farmer, and he told us that the only way he really knew the family, although they were parishioners, but he said they were very private people. And he says, but some very strange things are happening.
This was a man of age who had seen many things in his life. He was in his 70s and was not prone to any type of panic or exaggeration or embellishment or anything. He was just a nice, holy, religious person.
He said, I go there from time to time. I pray with the family, but it seems to antagonize what is there. It really isn't helping. He said, so I know I need your help.
Stay tuned for more Northern Mysteries.
On February 18, 1985, the Warrens met Maurice Theriault for the first time.
At that first meeting, they talked about the levitation of things. They talked about the writing on Maurice's back. Messages would be written on his back as if by a very fine scalpel. The blood would come right through the T-shirt. But if you took that T-shirt off, the blood would dematerialize in front of you.
I do remember the first meeting because it left quite an impression on me. I've been involved in many cases, and I'm a hard sell because of being a law enforcement officer. One of the phenomenon that allegedly happens if a person can be possessed is incredible feats of strength.
He could lift an object as heavy as a 450-pound statue.
He had a statue that he said he got from a cemetery, and that's what it looked like. It was maybe 5.5 feet tall, concrete. I think it was a statue of St. Teresa, because it looked like it had roses in its hand, but the roses were broken, and that's why the statue was tossed out. So he had it, and it was solid concrete. And after calling on this entity or demon or whatever he allegedly had, he was able to pick this statue up with his fingertips, which was pretty incredible because I'm 6'2", 220, and back then I was in really good shape, and I could just about lift it up with a bear hug.
They listened to his story and were impressed by the strange events that had marked his life for 30 years.
For us to say that this is a true case of demonic possession, we have to be able to document. It isn't just our word. We have to be able. We had him institutionalized for 30 days in a mental institution in Worcester, Mass. We had doctors evaluate him. We had to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt to the police, to the doctors, to the priest, to the family, all of these people involved that he was really under possession. I remember the doctors shaking their heads to us at a meeting and telling us there was nothing mentally wrong with this man, but they did say bizarre phenomena did surround him.
For them, it was perfectly clear that Maurice Theriault was possessed by at least one, if not more, demons.
Nancy, Maurice, Ed and I, and Father Homer Boyer met with Bishop Timothy Harrington at the rectory. And that day, the bishop was so moved by the plight of this man that he hugged him and said, "You are my brother, and I want to help you." And he performed the very first exorcism over him that day. The following Sunday, Maurice and Nancy were going to church. There's steep steps going up to the church. They got to the top step. Maurice somersaulted backwards through the air and down to the pavement. But you didn't get hurt. And the second exorcism was then planned. The third and final exorcism of Maurice was May 2nd of 1985.
The group surrounding Frenchie in the Warrens' modest Massachusetts home is deep in prayer. With them is a priest, Father McKenna, two demonologists, Lorraine Warren and her husband Ed, the policeman filming the session, and a few witnesses. This was his third exorcism. Following the ritual, Maurice Theriault's life became more or less normal. For a while, the Warrens kept in touch with him to make sure everything was all right. They knew from experience that a relapse was always possible. Maurice Theriault's was brutal. In November 1992, 7 years after Father McKenna's exorcism, Maurice Theriault sunk into a deep state of depression. He was no longer himself. The demonic force he knew so well again possessed him and took control of his fragile soul. On the night of November 4th, he called one of his daughters, Melinda, and begged her forgiveness.
He came to my house. My stepmother and him, my father, had gotten into an argument and she had to get a restraining order on him. He came to the house, he said, "I want you to have one last shot with me." And I'm like, "I don't drink, what are you talking about?" And just the demeanor on his face. And he never kissed me, he wasn't a huggable person, he didn't show love. But he was this day. I'm like, this is not him. And so at that point, I'm like, Maureen, I told my older sister, Maureen, the one that was there with me, I said, "Come with me, we've got to go there, we got to stop something." I was like, I could see two bodies. I felt this was going to happen because my father always said he was going to go the same way his father and mother did. He always said that. But my father had this well plotted. I knew that my stepmother was at bingo. Well, I get in my truck and I take my sister with me and we go to the house to write Nancy a letter to let her know we stopped by. I want to prove to my sister that, yeah, my father's here. Well, at that point, we get into the house, and there's no car in the driveway. And as we walked into the house, she started to write the letter, and I heard a pounding coming up from the basement, and it was footprints, and I heard it, and I knew it wasn't the dog. And it busted open, and I had a double-barrel shotgun pointed at my face. My father thought that I was Nancy, which was his wife. And he said, "Calm down, calm down." I went to grab the phone to call 911. He had already cut the phone lines. He had a truck parked a mile behind the house, so nobody would even think he was there. You wouldn't know that he was there. There was no visible signs. There's no police station in Whately. I got him to sit down on the couch and try to talk and reason with him to calm down, praying that Nancy would not come home. He said some apologies about not being, the dad he should have been, and, that this is what he has to do. And I kept telling him, no, this is not the way to do things. This is not. And Nancy drove in the driveway, and he got up in a rage. She came through the door, and my father said, we need to talk. And he said to her, I want to talk to you. And she started swearing, no, I don't want to talk to you. And she said, get the F out of my house. And with that, he shot her in the arm. Then he drug her back in the house, and I'm trying to help her make sure she's okay. And the next thing you know, he said to me, I love you. He yelled at his wife and said, look at me and remember this. And he said to me, forgive me, I love you. And he put the shotgun in his mouth, and he pulled the trigger and killed himself. He ended his life. And he's left me with a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of scars.
Some families' lives are marked by fate. It's as though for generation after generation, misfortune hovers over its members for no explainable reason. The innocent as well as the guilty can be cursed. Some people say the devil prefers to steal the purest souls from God. Perhaps the kind of purity characteristic of Maurice's soul when he was a young boy.
Maurice Theriault was my father. He was a farmer, and he came from Canada, and he ended up in a difficult situation.
The scientific community tends to believe that possession is nothing more than a form of mental illness or a personality disorder. But when he was most strongly afflicted with attacks, Maurice Theriault consulted a physician who was unable to find any particular pathological disorder. Was this just another ruse by the devil? Once a victim is trapped in a troubled world where nothing is certain anymore, is death the only way out?
Since the beginning of time, humankind has sensed the existence of mysterious forces. For some, these forces express manifestations of the divine. On the contrary, for others, these mysterious powers reveal an unknown aspect of the very nature of man, which can only be perceived using our sixth sense.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. Don't miss this Northern Mystery. During the Second World War, Third Reich troops pillaged the greatest museums of Europe.
While some of the treasures have been returned to their rightful owners, others have not yet been uncovered, leading to wild rumors. It has been said that gold and paintings by the great masters are scattered throughout the Austrian mountainside. There's even a rumor that traces of the gold stolen by the Nazis have been found in the Canadian Rockies. Impossible, you say? In January 1953, a Canadian Forces B-25 Mitchell bomber flew over Pitt Lake in the Rockies. Captain Jack McIntosh, a World War II veteran, and his co-pilot were heading to Sea Island Airport, just outside of Vancouver. But when the plane hit a stormy patch, it became difficult to control. McIntosh could tell that the freezing rain was affecting the movement of the wing flaps, causing the plane to lose altitude. The storm had reduced visibility to the point where they could no longer fly using visual flight rules. Everything that the crew tried to regain altitude was in vain. The B-25 was headed directly for Mount Spindle and crashed into the peak at 300 kilometers an hour, killing all of the crew aboard. The Nazis were infamous for pillaging during the Second World War. As a result, many of Europe's priceless treasures ended up in strongholds located throughout Germany. Nothing was spared, from paintings by the great masters to precious artifacts, including the famous spear used by the Roman centurion Longinus to pierce the side of Jesus Christ. Objects made of gold were melted down and transformed into bullion. When the war ended, art experts took on the task of tracking down the treasures stolen by the Nazis so that they could be returned to their rightful owners. According to legend, Canadian soldiers were rewarded for their efforts by discovering crates filled with gold bullion.
The gold was recovered from the basement of an old church in Germany by the Canadian military at the end of World War II. The Nazis had to send various caches of gold everywhere to keep it out of Allied hands. And the particular cache that ended up in the B-25 bomber was recovered from the basement of an old church, Roman Catholic church.
Hundreds of bricks were cast and marked with the Nazi eagle. The Third Reich weren't the only ones who were greedy. Rather than tell their superiors about their newfound wealth, the men decided to smuggle the gold out of the country. They did this so skillfully that their loot was literally forgotten. It wasn't until several years after the war ended, in January 1953 to be precise, that the mysterious crates suddenly reappeared on a Canadian Forces military base in Saskatchewan. The crates were loaded onto a B-25 headed for Sea Island, British Columbia.
The unofficial story is that the B-25 bomber, when it was in Saskatoon, was in fact loaded with gold bullion that had been, the Canadian Army had recovered after World War II in Germany. And I actually talked to an ex-military source of mine who said that his uncle saw the cargo being loaded onto the plane in big crates and labeled before its trip to Sea Island Airport in BC.
The crew was led by Captain Jack McIntosh, a war veteran who had engaged in air combat over Germany. Other than the gold, the aircraft was also carrying some $800,000 in cash.
All right. Officially, it was a training mission a routine training mission. That's what I was able to locate several documents which stated that that's what they're in fact doing. I was able to locate a cargo manifest as well, which was completely empty, and newspaper accounts which also backed up the story that it was actually a routine training flight.
The plane took off late that morning. The weather forecast called for squalls and storms over the coastal mountains, but they weren't expected until early evening. And according to the flight plan, the B-25 would be at its destination by then.
The plane was flying in from a northeastern direction, and it was caught in a storm. And the storm was really particularly nasty and it had lots of ice rain, which froze the flaps, and the plane was unable to control its elevation.
Captain McIntosh tried to fly between the snowy mountain caps, but the weather was freezing the cables that controlled the wing flaps. A catastrophe was inevitable. Before the crew even had time to issue a distress call, the B-25 crashed near Spindle Canyon. Several months passed before search teams scanned the area and finally found the wreckage.
On September 14th, 1953, a search party was sent up to the general area where the plane was where they thought the plane had gone down, and the military located the plane and the cargo, and they removed all the bodies from the wreck, as well as whatever cargo was there, be it valuable or not. The rumors regarding the gold started right around the same time as the plane went down, because there was a newspaper article printed at the time which stated that it was carrying a gold cargo as well as a payroll for the military.
More than 50 years have passed since the B-25 crashed, yet the impact site has remained virtually unchanged. Only a handful of prospectors from the area have succeeded in getting anywhere near the wreckage of the B-25, and there's been no evidence that they found either gold or money.
The only person that I've heard of who has found gold around the plane was the military. The source that I have, his uncle, was involved in the recovery of the cargo of the plane, and he claims that his uncle helped recover gold that had been scattered all over the mountaintop when the plane went down and impacted and exploded all over the place, and the gold was scattered all over. And they took what they found and they put it in an old mine shaft, which is just supposed to be located northeast of Spindle Canyon, to wait for when they could haul it all off the mountaintop. And since he was up there, other people, I don't know of any people that have gone up there to try and find it, but it's said that it is very possible to this day that there might still be gold up there, because when the plane went down, it hit the top of Spindle Canyon and the fuselage ripped open and the gold was scattered all over the place. And according to my source, there is still gold there because they did not recover it all.
The Nazi gold on board the B-25 may never be found, but the mere idea that it may still exist continues to feed the fantasies of adventure lovers. For mystery lovers, British Columbia is a breeding ground for all things bizarre. Its unique landscape can certainly set one's imagination in motion with its snow-capped mountains and clear blue lakes. Tales were told of forgotten mines discovered back in the Klondike days. Then there were stories of ape-like creatures roaming the province's virgin forests. And now there are rumors of this gold stolen by the Third Reich. It's enough to make the other Canadian provinces jealous.
No piece of information is ever negligible to a treasure hunter, whether it be a press clipping that looks unimportant at first glance or an old manuscript collecting dust in the back of a museum. A dream led Marcel Robillard to the Anglo-Saxon, a commercial ship that sank off the coast of Newfoundland in 1863. A dream so lucid, so clear, that he felt it had to be real.
May 1983. Marcel Robillard slowly gets ready to plunge into the cold water of Clam Cove, Newfoundland. When the time comes, he swims swiftly towards a shipwreck lying some 30 meters deep. Alongside the wreck, he begins following the deck rail. He notices various blackened metal objects. He carefully picks one up. It's a silver serving tray. At the sight of the object, the diver is overcome by a strange feeling, a sense of dizziness. Images rush through his head, panicked passengers fleeing towards the decks as the corridors below deck become filled with smoke. 30 meters underwater in the icy depths of Clam Cove, Marcel Robillard can't help but imagine the final moments of the Anglo-Saxon and her passengers, a drama that for him reaches far beyond his interest in the story. When Marcel Robillard was 5 or 6 years old, he became fascinated with the sea and ships. Often awakening from nightmares with terrifying images of shipwrecks, the boy even began asking questions that amazed his parents.
As a child, I remember asking my mother where my wife and children were. This upset my mother no end. My voice was different. I was talking like someone older in someone else's voice. All she could say was, "This just can't be." And then she went around and asked everyone, "Why is he like that?" A lot of people thought I was possessed by demons.
Though his parents attributed their son's questions to his fertile imagination, Marcel knew there was more to it. As the years went by, his fascination with the sea and tales of pirates evolved into an obsession.
I used to wake up in the middle of the night. I was choking. I was in a panic. Then I saw all these beings on a rocky cliff. They seemed to be calling out for me to help them. Where do we go? What do we do? Then deep inside I knew I had to get to my ship. I had no inkling what kind of ship it was, no idea where it might even be.
More time passed, and at age 18, Marcel Robillard signed up for a diving course. His training landed him a job welding caissons during construction of the Louis-Hippolyte Lafontaine Tunnel in Montreal. But Marcel Robillard felt the call of the Maritimes. For him, his destiny lay in Newfoundland. From talking to fishermen, he learned there were countless wrecks offshore, some of which had never been explored.
There are lots and lots of shipwrecks between St. John's, Newfoundland and St. Shots. On a distance of about 100 miles, there are 400 wrecks that we know about, more than enough to go around. There's no way I could get to each and every one of them. I think Newfoundland is a spot where the greatest number of underwater treasures are still waiting to be found.
With friends, he began exploring many of the shipwrecks. He collected copper and bronze objects, such as propellers and pipes, which he sold to local scrapyards. With this source of income, he was able to spend all his time exploring wrecks.
I've dived on lots and lots of shipwrecks, but it's salvaging metals that actually paid. Bronze, copper, pewter. We used to blow them apart using dynamite. We'd bring up loads of the stuff, drag it up the hill, put it in my car, and drive down to St. John's, Newfoundland, sell it for scrap. It was an adventure beyond imagination.
In 1967, something happened that turned Marcel Robillard's life upside down. As he was heading for Cape Race with friends to do some diving, he saw what looked like a huge cliff advancing across the sea. Overcome by a strange sensation, he ordered the captain to stop there.
I said, "Stop right here. This is where we're diving." I said, "Not over here, not over there along the coast, right here. This is where we're diving, that's it." So I dived, and while I was going down, this really odd feeling came over me. Then, on the bottom, the wreck was all scattered around. I came across a fork, and it had the words Anglo-Saxon on it. All sorts of images ran through my mind. It was as though they were all just parading in front of my eyes, and then I knew I had just discovered the thing that I'd been looking for all my life.
The Anglo-Saxon, a passenger sailing ship, went under in 1863. Marcel Robillard was convinced he had discovered something important, something that had been calling him since his earliest childhood. In the 70s, he became interested in Oriental philosophy and learned about reincarnation. He now considers the theory of past lives the only possible explanation for his strange feeling about the Anglo-Saxon.
A reincarnation is a belief system, goes way back, probably 3,000 to 5,000 years. It's a belief that we have lived before, and we will live again after we die of some interval, that our current life is simply a link in a long, unbroken chain of lifetimes.
Marcel Robillard next began doing research to learn a little more about the Anglo-Saxon.
The Anglo-Saxon was a passenger ship. It used to sail between England, Quebec City, and Montreal. This was a very fine ship, 283 feet long, a three-master. There was a small steam engine on board, but most of the time it was under sail.
On April 16, 1863, the ship sailed from England for Montreal with 446 passengers aboard. At its helm was Captain William Burgess, a young officer aged 31. 9 days later, while approaching Cape Race in Newfoundland, the Anglo-Saxon entered a thick fog. The sails were lowered, but Captain Burgess failed to order a depth probe. That proved to be a catastrophic error in judgment. The ship ran into rocks just under the surface, tearing the hull. The crew and passengers tried to flee the sinking ship amid total panic.
The ship ran aground there, taking 237 passengers with her. About 200 bodies were put in a burial pit. At the far end of this pit, there was a rock about 400 feet away, and then at the end, there was like a little beach, and all the beings were gathered there. The thing that struck me the most in all this is that, okay, the captain made a mistake. He didn't take a depth reading. It was his second trip. He was only 31 and very proud of himself. As he was sailing along the coast without a depth reading, he was closer to the shore than he thought, and he ran onto the rocks. He was responsible for the death of 237 people.
As he began documenting the tragedy of the Anglo-Saxon, Marcel Robillard became totally convinced that he's the reincarnation of Captain Burgess. He felt that the only way to exorcise the images of women and children screaming in terror was to return to the wreck. He had to free the souls imprisoned in the Anglo-Saxon.
I had to accomplish my mission. I had to go back there. I had to bring them to Montreal. The captain is always the last one to leave his ship. I had to get the passengers to their destination. Perhaps not bodily, but I at least had to bring these beings who were there.
In spring 1983, Marcel Robillard organized an expedition to explore the wreck of the Anglo-Saxon. For him, it was a chance to make peace with his past. Marcel Robillard was the first diver to reach the sunken ship. As he approached it, his heart began racing. A chill ran through him. As bubbles rose to the surface, images swarmed through his head. He imagined the souls of the victims imprisoned in the remnants of the ship. Despite the emotion gripping his throat, he knew this dive was the only way for him to find peace.
When your mind is full of images about something that's happened in the past, these images stay with you. And then, as long as you don't repair whatever harm has been done, you'll be stuck with these memories forever. But in the end, everything fell into place. A real calm came over me. Total peace. It changed my life completely.
As amazing as Marcel Robillard's story of incarnation may seem, there are other verified cases of individuals remembering their past lives.
I have published one case of a man who spoke Norse, which is the language of the Vikings. It's phonetically related to modern-day Icelandic and Norwegian. And we tape recorded this subject and had an expert in the languages of Iceland and Norway listen to it. And the questions that we asked the individual related to his events as a sailor, and the translation, as best the expert could do, related to events at sea, related to ships.
With his last dive to the Anglo-Saxon in 1983, Marcel Robillard made peace with the souls of the English ship's passengers, and at the same time, freed himself of 120 years of remorse.
To me, the Anglo-Saxon is not a mystery anymore. I'm totally convinced that I was the captain on board. I made a mistake, but at least I said it right. Once you've said it right, it's done with. I'm really glad that the beings got to Montreal, to Quebec, took new bodies, and lived happily.
For Marcel Robillard, the quest for the Anglo-Saxon became somewhat of a spiritual odyssey. In the end, his greatest discovery was not the riches buried at the bottom of the ocean, but rather those buried within himself. The precious treasures that lie within each of us are something that no administration, no government can ever take away.
Fantastic encounters, enigmatic disappearances, and fabulous legends. Maybe someone can finally reveal the truth behind these mysteries, and maybe that someone is you.
I'm Kenneth Welsh. You are watching Northern Mysteries. A tall tale is what we call a story that is so exaggerated that it's impossible to believe. What if a storyteller said that he'd seen a sea monster so huge that it was like something out of Jurassic Park? Those who have had a chance encounter with such a creature know that they are not telling a tall tale, and their conviction often results in them bearing the brunt of sarcasm and ridicule. One of these wondrous beasts exists in Quebec. Its name is Memphrey.
It was the morning of May 18th, 2003, and Lake Memphremagog was practically deserted. Jean Grenier, a resident of the small town of Magog, which borders on the lake, was about to cast his line. Grenier noticed some unusual reflections, as if the water was being disturbed by something beneath the surface. Suddenly, a dark object rose out of the water without a splash. Jean Grenier watched the animal for close to 3 minutes. He couldn't see the head or tail, but he could tell that it was large. This fisherman from Magog would never forget his experience that morning. The day he saw Memphrey, the legendary monster of Lake Memphrey-Magog. Located in Quebec's eastern townships, Lake Memphrey-Magog is 52 kilometers long, 22 of which belong to the American state of Vermont. For 2 centuries, tales have been told of a strange beast that lives in the lake. When colonists first arrived in America, natives claimed that they never swam in the lake because it was filled with anacondas, which means large snakes.
Memphrey's story is the story of Lake Memphrey-Magog. At school, the treatise on geography, published in 1871 by the Christian Brothers in Quebec, taught us that there are no dangerous animals in Canada, except for the monster that shows up every now and again for free in Lake Memphrey-Magog. Ever since I started studying this phenomenon, the number of sightings has averaged about 3 a year. But there have been as many as 14 appearances in 1 year. And we've had some very convincing ones. For example, in the morning it could show up in Newport in the United States, which is on the southern part of Lake Memphrey-Magog, around, let's say, 10 a.m. And then in the evening, around 5 p.m., it'd be seen again about 10 miles away. The same phenomena have been observed by different people, which is quite convincing.
One such sighting was made by Adrien Rompré. On May 5th, 2000, the retired Montreal police officer happened to look out on the lake from his home and noticed something leaving a wake as it moved quickly along the surface of the water.
I thought it was my neighbor taking his boat out. That's what got my attention, because I never believed what Mr. Boisvert said when people told him they had seen Memphrey, as he's known. But I never believed it. But then when I saw this thing, this beast, I said to myself, that's him, that's Memphrey.
Hey, Claire. Claire, viens ici. What?
So of course I called my wife. I said, come see, there's something out there in the water. She came along with me, and then she saw, just like me, that there was something that we'd never seen in the lake before. It was a wave caused by that fish. No, not a fish, because it wasn't a fish. That beast that was coming towards us, that was snaking above and below the surface. The two of us watched for a good long while. It looked like a sea otter to me. I can't say for sure, but it might have been one. At any rate, it was really strange. It was about 4 or 5 feet long, with a rather big head, huge eyes, and whiskers on both sides of its mouth. Then we lost sight of it because it dived quite deep, or at least it would seem so since we didn't see it again.
On l'a pas revu. La question.
I get asked quite often if there are any scientific studies that tried to prove whether or not this phenomenon exists.
L'existence ou la non-existence de ce phénomène.
I should add that one year a student came from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and together with one of my friends, went the whole length of the lake and back with what we call a site scan. And they found nothing out of the ordinary. At that time, they found nothing indicating there was a creature in the lake. I was a fishing guide on Lake Memphremagog. I was out early that morning trolling for gray trout with a man from Villejac-Cartier.
On June 18, 1989, Mr. Charland and his client were fishing in the depths of the lake. Suddenly, his sonar picked up a large underwater object bearing down directly upon them.
All of a sudden, I said to Mr. Hamel, "Watch out," I said. "I think we're going to capsize." "What do you mean?" We had just picked up something really big on the sonar, something that didn't belong there, for the plain and simple reason that I knew the area inside out, and it wasn't a rock, that wasn't it. And I said, "Hold on to the boat, here it comes." I looked over and I saw it. It was about the size of a horse, with a tail about 12 to 14 feet long, and it had two legs in front. It was upright. And then I took off after it, and I tried to get a closer look with the motor at full speed. And when we were about 150, 200 feet away from it, it went underwater. No way, there really was something there. If I hadn't seen it, I would tell you I hadn't seen it, but I saw it with my very own eyes. The other guy who was with me saw it too. He didn't want to go back. He didn't want to go back on the lake. "We're not going to hang around here, let's get out of here." Now, we don't know how many of them there might be in this lake, but I saw one once, and that was enough for me. It's hard to say because we're in 2005, and just last week I read in L'Actualité, the news magazine, that new species of animals were still being discovered on land. I'm not talking about the water, just the land. But the same goes for the water. Every year we discover thousands and thousands of new animal species in the water. It's not easy to say for sure, since this whole business of sea monsters from all parts of the world still eludes us.
Lac Memphremagog.
And it's your vacation?
Oui. My vacation? Dans la belle Provence.
Ben ouais.
These images are taken from an amateur video filmed on August 12, 1997 by tourist Patricia de Bruin-Fournier and her husband Daniel Long. Something unusual happened as the couple was fishing peacefully that day.
My wife was videotaping at the time, just as she tends to do quite often. And we noticed the wave. She immediately zoomed in on it. We probably saw it for 10 to 15 seconds before it seemed to disappear. The object, whatever was causing this, seemed to submerge again. It's a very short clip.
That's weird. That's too weird.
It definitely wasn't a log. It was moving too quickly. It was an animate object. There was something, to me, something was below the surface, moving, producing that wave. I can't speculate whether it's a fish. It would be a large one if it was, and it wasn't normal fish behavior that I've seen swimming below the surface for any great length. So I don't know. I don't have a good guess.
The footage was analyzed by experts who have been at a loss to identify the beast living in the lake. Is it a 200-year-old sturgeon? A dinosaur from Jurassic Park? An unknown species of lake monster? All of these theories seem highly improbable. But improbable does not mean impossible. Sherlock Holmes was quoted as saying, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth."
At times, when researchers try to investigate strange phenomena like the monster in Lake Memphremagog, they find themselves in a vicious circle. In order to obtain concrete proof, researchers need specialized equipment, techniques, and logistics. It's the type of work that requires major funding. But without a shred of evidence, no investor is going to put up a dime for the research. And without the investment, it's impossible to prove these phenomena. In the meantime, the tall tales continue to be told. In examining the files of cryptozoology, researchers interested in legendary and extinct species find that the Earth would seem to be a strange world. From the forests of the North American West Coast to the depths of the Pacific Ocean, there are dozens of incredible creatures that are as yet unclassified according to traditional zoology. Who hasn't heard of the Loch Ness Monster? Or the Yeti, the abominable snowman of the Himalayan mountains? You may not have heard of their lesser-known cousins, the Mokele-Membe, a small dinosaur living in the forests of Africa, or the thunderbirds, giant birds flying straight out of native legend.
Alberta, 1925. Two tourists in a canoe pulled up to the shore of a beautiful lake at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. As they were taking their boat out of the water, they noticed a big brown bird flying very high in the sky. They assumed it was an eagle. But as it approached them, they realized how huge it was. The bird seemed to be carrying a large object. Since the animal was headed directly towards them, the tourists began shouting to distract it. The bird, perhaps frightened by the sudden outcry, dropped its prey and disappeared behind a nearby hill. The two men headed to the spot where the prey had fallen. To their surprise, it was neither a rabbit nor a squirrel. It was a large animal. They took the carcass to the park warden to have it weighed. It was 6 kilograms. It would be surprising enough to see a bird of prey carrying an object weighing 1 or 2 kilograms, but 6 kilograms, that would be highly improbable. What if it was an unusual species of bird, like the legendary thunderbirds spoken of in native tales?
Thunderbirds are giant predatory birds with wingspans that are twice the size of what are recognized as large birds. The South American condor is the largest wingspan recognized, and these birds typically are twice that size.
There have always been stories about the existence of giant birds. In North America, giant birds are part of many First Nation traditions. We can often see them depicted on totem poles and in native artwork. These giant birds are called by different names, depending on the native community. In pop culture, they are referred to as thunderbirds.
The most famous name is thunderbirds because in the Great Lakes area and in the Pacific Northwest, it's in the spring when the storms return to the northlands and to places like from Ontario to British Columbia. That's when the thunderbirds return. They migrate north back into those areas where they nest, and that's where the Indians have pointed to locations saying that's where the thunderbirds used to nest.
According to First Nation tradition, thunderbirds disappeared shortly before white men arrived in North America. However, eyewitness accounts seem to indicate that some of these huge birds may have survived up until now. In September 1974, Daniel Caron, a resident of Louvicourt, Quebec, was heading home when he saw a huge bird drinking from a pool of water. Surprised at the size of the bird, which he guessed to be more than 1.2 meters tall, he ran to tell his sister about it. They decided to get closer, but the bird sensed their presence and flew away. They were amazed at how big it was. The next day, their neighbor saw the same large bird. As soon as he tried to approach, the bird flew off into the distance. "24 hours later, Suzanne Caron saw it again in her backyard. She yelled out to her neighbor that the bird was back.
Mimi! Yeah!
The young man rushed over with his .22 caliber rifle and shot at the bird without hitting it. At the sound of the gunshot, the bird flew off, flapping its wings slowly. It was never seen again.
In 1977, in Illinois, there was a famous case of a young boy, 10-year-old boy named Marlon Lowe, who was picked up by a giant bird and carried for several hundred feet and then dropped. This was in front of his playmates as well as some adults who came on the scene. So there are witnesses to that incident, and it's become quite famous.
To zoologists, thunderbirds are merely legendary animals. The sightings are attributed to inexperienced observers having seen a California condor, a bald eagle, or a vulture. But surprise and inexperience don't explain everything. Pilots have also been known to tell tales of these mysterious birds. Although there are no birds listed in today's wildlife that correspond to the description of the thunderbirds, this was not always the case. Thousands of years ago, North American skies were filled with huge birds called teratorns.
The explanation for thunderbirds is likely to lie in the existence of teratorn vultures known from fossil remains. There's an abundance of them from the Pleistocene, found in places like the La Brea tar pits in California. And those birds are in the up to about 18 to 20 feet with a wingspan known by fossils. As time goes by, we have found larger and larger fossil remains of teratorns. So they are a good candidate to explain the modern thunderbirds that have survived into the present day.
While most observers claim that the thunderbirds look like gigantic eagles, others say that they look like teratorns. In October 2002, Inuits in Alaska claimed to have seen a bird as large as a plane that looked like a pterodactyl. Around the same period, Nina Fulford, an artist from New Westminster, BC, also saw one of these mysterious pterodactyls.
It was huge, very, very large, and it had enormous wings. So as it flew, it was a very slow motion type of flying. It had a very long neck, small head at the end of it with a crest on it, thin legs hanging down, and this long appendage that you'd call a tail that came out of the back with a V-shaped appendage attached to the end of it.
The thought that pterodactyls could have survived up till now is a fanciful idea. However, many observers swear that was exactly what they saw. Skeptics insist that only physical proof will end the debate. That's where the problem lies. Despite hundreds of eyewitness accounts collected to date, no convincing proof has ever been presented. As for photos and tapes of so-called thunderbirds, they are far from convincing. There's nothing to prove that they are not just a hoax. Who knows what these witnesses really saw?
Whether they are flying, swimming, or crawling, these mythical creatures, real or imaginary, fascinate us since they seem to be from another era. They come from different cultures and legends. The fact that they seem to have survived over the ages leads cryptozoologists to conclude that where there's smoke, there's fire. After all, people have been seeing these creatures for decades, centuries even, and they can't all be mistaken. Can they?
Fantastic encounters, enigmatic disappearances, and fabulous legends. Maybe someone can finally reveal the truth behind these mysteries, and maybe that someone is you.
I'm Kenneth Welsh with more Northern Mysteries. The involvement of mediums in police investigations is often the result of a personal decision. Either the family requests the assistance of a psychic, or a police officer seeks one out on the sly, without advising his superiors that he is resorting to this unusual means of investigation. But there are exceptions. Cases where police officers have officially sought out the assistance of a medium. The Vernon Boer case was one of those rare instances. It's July, and the evening breeze has started blowing across the farmland of Manville, Alberta. Two sisters, Dorothy and Alberta Boer, head for the house after a long day of labor. Inside the house, Dorothy discovers her old brother Frederick sprawled on the kitchen floor. Her first thought is that he fell and was knocked unconscious. But in fact, his head appears to be seriously injured. At the same time, her sister Alberta finds their mother. She too has a head injury, and the tablecloth is stained with blood. Horrified, the two women look for help. They meet their brother Vernon, who also made the macabre discovery a few moments earlier. He tells them that one of the farmhands is also dead in the barn. It was now 9 o'clock.
One of the most amazing criminal cases in Canada had just begun. The Vernon Boer case.
Vernon was the one that notified the neighbor that the bodies had been discovered. The actual killings took place over about a 2 or 2.5 hour period between 6 p.m. and about 8 or 8:30 p.m. On July 9th. And Vernon, at about 8:30 to 9 o'clock, ran over to an adjacent farmer's house and asked them to notify the authorities. The Booher farm apparently didn't have a telephone, but the neighbor did, and the neighbor phoned the police.
At 11 p.m., when Officer Frederick Olson called medical examiner Joseph Heaslip, they could only come to a dour conclusion. 4 adults shot at point-blank range with a .30-03.
Vernon's story at the time was that he had gone out during the evening hours when the murders took place to round up some cattle of theirs that was out in the field. And he heard some shots fired, he said, when he was doing that. And therefore, he wasn't there to witness any of the events. He just arrived subsequent to the murders occurring.
Young Boer then told Officer Olson that after finding the bodies of his mother and brother, he ran to the building to fetch Gabriel Gromley, one of the 2 men working for his father. That's when he discovered the farmhand's body lying face down with several gunshot wounds. Vernon said that in a panic, he ran to their neighbors, the Ross family, to have them call the police. Back at the farm, he encountered his 2 sisters. It was only later, while looking through the other buildings, that he found the body of Vasil Rozak, the other farmhand hired by his father, laying in the barn with 2 bullets in his head. Hearing the story, Officer Olson couldn't help but notice how unusually calm young Vernon Boer was.
Initially, there was no murder weapon found. Subsequent to the murders, the 2 police officers involved in the case, Detective Leslie and Inspector Hancock, and some local farmers, tried to search the property and locate a high-powered hunting rifle. And they thought that they were searching for a 303 because the day before the murders, at an adjacent farm, a 303 had gone missing. And the farmer, I think his name was Stevenson, had testified in court that really Vernon, his brother Fred, and one of the hired hands were the only other people that knew where the firearm was kept in their farm. The rifle was taken, as well as some shells. So this was the day before the killing took place on the Booher farm.
For Officer Olson, Boer looked more and more like a prime suspect. Less than a week after the murders, the 21-year-old farmer was arrested and led off to jail in Manville.
Vernon had indicated that his older brother Fred, who was about 25 years old, and Vernon was 21 at the time, and Vernon's mom had given him a hard time about a girl he liked. And that was his rationale for killing them.
Though the detectives thought they had found the motive for the murders, they were still missing the weapon they needed to officially charge the accused. That's when Maximilian Langsner entered the picture.
Langsner was, as I understand it, a bit of a stage personality who practiced hypnotism and alleged to be able to read minds or pick up thoughts from people. And he also was a self-styled criminologist.
Commissioner William Bryan of the Alberta Provincial Police invited OXO Maximilian Langsner, who was touring Canada, to come to Edmonton. Bryan thought the psychic might turn up evidence against Boer.
Langsner met with Boer on several occasions. The first occasion was about July 18th, and he was allowed to sit in Vernon's cell for a space of several hours. Now, he was instructed not to say anything or ask Vernon any questions, but his presence, I think, probably caused some anxiety to Vernon. And Vernon didn't say much of anything that I'm aware of to Langsner. The next day, Langsner did the same thing, but after a few minutes, apparently went up to the inspector's office and said that he thought that Vernon was about to confess.
As predicted by Langsner, strangely enough, during more thorough police searches of the murder scenes, the murder weapon was found, and it was by Langsner himself.
Essentially, Langsner was a fraud. I don't think that he could read people's minds, and whether or not he had an ability to hypnotize people wouldn't have helped him find a rifle. But going back out to the farm again with the police to do another search and perhaps look in some spots that might not have been thoroughly searched before, gave them another opportunity, I think, to find the murder weapon. And in fact, Vernon did, a short while thereafter, call the inspector down and made a confession.
Vernon Boer's trial began on September 24, 1928 in Edmonton. The witnesses included Maximilian Langsner. His presence also gave rise to sharp exchanges between him and Judge W.C. Simmons, who made no effort to conceal his skepticism about Langsner's self-proclaimed psychic powers.
The judge said, okay, well, if you can, words to this effect, if you can read minds, maybe you can read my mind. And he, in fact, said to Langsner, I'm thinking about something that was mentioned about you earlier in the trial. Can you tell me what it was? And Langsner was completely unable to identify what that was. And I think that just reinforced in the judge's mind that Langsner was probably a fraud.
After a 4-day trial, Vernon Boer was sentenced to be hanged. His lawyer appealed, arguing that his client's confession had been obtained under hypnosis. So Boer got a new trial.
The physical evidence, I think, amounted to the .303 rifle that Stevenson said was similar to the one that he had.
Wake up.
A total of 9 shots were fired at the murder scene, and 1 shell casing only was found, and it came from a .303. There was a forensic expert that testified that the mark on that shell casing was consistent with one that they fired from the murder weapon they found. I think that had a stranger or an intruder committed the offense, they wouldn't have known that they had the amount of time they did to commit the murders. Vernon knew that his father was at a farm 10 kilometers away. He knew that both of his sisters were away in Manville, and he knew what time they were going to come home. He knew that the only people there were his mother and his brother, and the 2 farmhands were out working the property. And it was their misfortune, I think, to come back earlier than he had anticipated.
The second trial got underway on January 21st, 1929. Even without Vernon Boer's confession, the evidence was overwhelming. In particular, his fingerprints were on a shell that had come from the murder weapon found in the kitchen near his mother's body. The second trial also ended with a death sentence for Vernon Boer. He was immediately sent to Fort Saskatchewan Prison, where he was hanged on April 24th, 1929. The execution brought the curtain down on the story of Vernon Boer.
I think that even today, sometimes police services are contacted by people who claim to have access to evidence or information because of their psychic abilities. I think that any piece of evidence that might help solve an offense, and particularly a tragic one like occurred in the Booher farm, shouldn't be ignored. Obviously, how it's entered as evidence and whether it's even evidence at a trial has to be taken into careful consideration. And I think that's what happened in the Booher case ultimately, is that the evidence that was tainted, I suspect, by Langsner, was not allowed as evidence in the second trial.
The supernatural does not generally enter the equation when it comes to police investigations and crime solving. Investigators prefer using tried and true empirical means. Occasionally, their techniques fail to provide all of the answers, and there are times when people working in the realm of the paranormal already have a lead in the case. In October 1970, the Canadian press was filled with news of the kidnapping of James Richard Cross by a group known as the Front de Libération du Québec, or the FLQ. Every radio and TV station waited expectantly for breaking news in the case. That is, every station except for a small local radio station in Vancouver. Without realizing it, the listeners were already aware of what was going to happen next, thanks to Irene Hughes. Early on the morning of October 5th, 1970, a group of men showed up at the residence of British diplomat James Richard Cross on Crescent Street in Montreal and kidnapped him at gunpoint. The kidnapping of the 49-year-old diplomat was the first political abduction in Canada's history.
Don't move!
That afternoon, the leaders of the kidnappers issued a statement identifying themselves as the Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ, a group of militant separatists who believed that violence was the only way to achieve independence for Quebec. On October 10th, 1970, as political authorities were refusing to give in to the FLQ's demands for the release of the British diplomat, another group of FLQ activists kidnapped Pierre Laporte, the provincial minister of Labor and Immigration, in front of his home in the St. Lambert district of Montreal. Quebec was facing its darkest hour. It was the 1970 October crisis. While the police and army were scouring Quebec in search of the two hostages, at the other end of Canada, Robert Cummings, host of the radio talk show Afterthought, was using less conventional means to obtain information on the case by contacting American psychic Irene Hughes.
Now we go to Chicago, where we are joined by a psychic woman called Irene Hughes. Hello, Irene. What is your feeling about the situation in Quebec now?
With the first gentleman, Cross, I feel that there would be no physical harm. However, I feel there will be physical harm with the second.
It all began on October the 14th, 1970. He explained to me that the FLQ in Canada, terrorists, had taken two important authorities of the Canadian government, and he wondered if I had any impressions about them. And I said, yes, I do.
Cummings didn't just pick Irene Hughes' name out of the phone book. She had gained national fame after predicting the fire on board Apollo 13 3 years earlier.
I predicted the Apollo spaceship fire, where 3 men died in it. And I described what would cause the fire, that there was an electrical cord that was around the center of it, and that it would catch on fire and destroy the ship, and it did.
While law enforcement agencies were closing in on a few individuals suspected of being involved in the kidnappings, Irene Hughes was providing surprising predictions from her home in Chicago to listeners in Prince George, British Columbia.
Actually, I would pinpoint November the 6th of this year. I said 2 or 3 months, but I feel that something very striking and surprising, some news may come on November the 6th.
Once again, Irene Hughes was on the mark.
Le gouvernement pourchassera sans relâche les coupables.
At 4 a.m. on October 16th, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau implemented the War Measures Act, signifying that Quebec was in a state of siege. The next day, October 17th, the body of Pierre Laporte was found in the trunk of a car near the Saint-Hubert Airport, just outside of Montreal. The minister had been murdered. Irene Hughes' predictions had proven to be right once more.
What about Mr. Cross? Now, you indicated to
Robert
me...
Cummings contacted Irene Hughes again on October 18th.
How do you feel about this?
I feel that he is still alive, and I get the impression that if the authorities offered more money than that which has been requested by the FLQ, this man's life might be spared.
And then I told them that I felt in other conversations, phone conversations, that the terrorists were in a 3-story brick building 5 miles northwest of the city, and that's where they would find them. And so the mass manhunt started by the government, and they found them.
When he finished speaking with Irene, Cummings phoned the RCMP, but they were clearly not interested in anything that this highly accurate psychic had to say. They even suggested that Cummings stop phoning her, claiming that it was interfering with their investigation.
He called me 9 times, and he told me that he was on the air several times until they did not want that information broadcast because I don't know why, but anyway, it was in those other conversations that I told him where they would find the terrorists and that they would be caught, and they were. But it took he called me several times because he was on the air and he was only talking with me a few minutes, and then at one time he talked with me 45 minutes.
On November 6th, a date that Irene Hughes had predicted would be significant, the police arrested Bernard Lortie, one of Pierre Laporte's kidnappers. It was the first breakthrough in the case.
Mr. Cross was abducted on October 5th, and 62 days later, on December 3rd, 1970, the October crisis was about to come to an end, when RCMP investigators followed a suspect that finally led them to Rue des Récollets. Everything pointed to the fact that Mr. Cross was being held at 10,945 Rue des Récollets in Montreal North.
A red brick triplex stands at 10945 des Récollets, just 6.5 kilometers from downtown Montreal. Once again, Irene Hughes' predictions were coming true. The kidnappers agreed to release the British diplomat in exchange for safe passage to Cuba. James Cross was finally a free man. Even after all these years, Irene Hughes has never forgotten her involvement in the events that marked one of the saddest periods in Canadian history.
Whether it be in the Vernon Boer case or the tapes recorded by Irene Hughes, psychic experiences, particularly clairvoyance, are often associated with dangerous situations, crises, and moments of dire necessity or incredible motivation. These unusual abilities seem to be somehow related to emotions. And that's exactly what makes it so difficult to study these gifts. Although it's possible to produce a chemical reaction at will, the same cannot be said for emotions. In parapsychology, contrary to most areas of science, men and women are not merely passive observers. They are part of the equation.
Since the beginning of time, humankind has sensed the existence of mysterious forces. For some, these forces express manifestations of the divine. On the contrary, for others, these mysterious powers reveal an unknown aspect of the very nature of man, which can only be perceived using our sixth sense.